This is George Topalidis with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, Black Faculty Recruitment and Retention at UF Oral History Project. I'm joined here today with Dr. Kenneth Nunn and my friend Deon Winchester, and we're going to get started, Dr. Nunn, by asking, where were you born and where did you grow up?
Well, I was born in the Philippines at Clark Air Force Base. My father was in the Air Force. So I would say that I spent most of my formative years in Omaha, Nebraska, but he traveled around. I spent some time in South Florida at Air Force Base south of Miami, spent some time in England, but most of my time was in Omaha, Nebraska, which was where my parents met. My mother was from Nebraska. My father was from North Carolina, but he was stationed at Offutt Air Force Base. They bussed the black girls in to meet the the airmen, and he was on base. And my mother and him, hit it off, and the rest is history, as they say.
Now, can you share with us some experiences of your formative years that made you feel a sense of inclusiveness and belonging?
Well, I grew up, I grew up there. My parents got divorced. I think I was probably 12 at that point. But I would say I grew up on the near north side of Omaha, Nebraska, which was a historically African-American community. As I said, my mother was from there. My great-grandparents came to Nebraska on a covered wagon from Missouri. My great-grandfather and his, great-grandfather, that was my great-grandfather. My great-great-grandfather had a 12-year-old bride, and I don't remember, he was probably in his 20s, and he went to Nebraska and, found a job in a dry goods store. So that's what they were doing. And so anyway, there was a community of African Americans that was situated what's known as the near north side of Omaha. So I grew up in that community. I felt like I was a part of the community. I went to the same high school that my grandmother went to and that my mother went to. All my uncles, Omaha Technical High School. And at the time that I was going there, they started to have plans to close it down, basically, part of their desegregation plan. And one of my heroes, who I actually learned about later, was Derek Bell. He's kind of become sort of a newsworthy these days because this brouhaha about critical race theory, which he's probably viewed as the founder of. But he was at that time a civil rights attorney for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And his job was to litigate this desegregation case in Omaha. And they intervened and they were like, no, you can't close that school down. So they turned it into a magnet program. But, part of that was social activism. We were out and picketing and marching, to try and preserve our high school. So it was really interesting to me when I got to Gainesville and I heard about the efforts to keep Lincoln High open, that the community kind of gathered around and fought that struggle. They lost here, but we were successful, at least for a while. I mean, now they did close the high school, I think, probably about 10 years after I graduated. But I think that all built a sense of community for me and built a sense of the importance of protests and, activism toward keeping the things that, help make you whole together, for those of us of African descent in America. So that's probably the story I would tell to answer that question.
Did you experience any prejudice or discrimination during your formative years, either in your neighborhood, grade school, or high school?
Well, I did, because I started out, as I said, living at Homestead Air Force Base in South Florida. And we used to go to Nebraska once a year to visit my grandparents there. And sometimes we'd ride the train. Sometimes we drove. But when we drove, we had to make sure that we packed up enough food and items for the trip. You know, this is a well-told story about people who traveled through the South in the 50s and 60s. And in my case, it was the early 60s. We could not, go to restaurants and hotels and things of that nature. We slept in the car, ate our food. We had to find places to be able to go to the bathroom, usually outside, until we got north of, Tennessee, whatever. And we didn't have to have that. So that was probably the first memory of that sort of thing when I was growing up. And I would say that although Omaha itself was in the North, they had like their own history of racism, racial violence and the like. There's a very famous picture of a Black man being burnt, in a lynching, and that took place in Omaha. My grandmother was aware of the crowds. She saw the crowds. She didn't actually see the lynching. But it was, there were certainly places that you had to be cautious about where you went and what you did and where you were caught, after hours. So I would say that, there were incidents of discrimination and the like that I experienced growing up. I can't, I have a deep memory of some incidents of police brutality. I don't necessarily remember any racial prejudice, that occurred to me in particular. But yeah, that was something we had to pay attention to.
Professor Nunn, growing up, can you speak to when did you first become aware of your race, and what words, if you recall, did your elders, your parents share with you about it?
I think I was aware of the fact that I was not, a white person, and that I was an African American, or what we called probably a Negro in that era, soon to be Black. But I think I was probably aware of that when I was a young kid in Florida, because, we used to, we used to have conflicts in school. At that point, it was probably elementary school, but it was clear to me that I was different, that my family was different, that the food we ate was different. I remember, and this is probably a little bit later, I was probably, actually, no, I think I was around 6. I may have been in Florida. I may have been in England by that point. I remember asking my mother why Black singers sounded different. Because I could pick that up, that when I was listening to records and the things that they would play is that, I could tell that a person was Black. And I remember asking my mother about that. And she said, well, they just have soul. That's that soul you're hearing. And I never really found that as a satisfactory answer, but I was aware of it, at that point in time. I don't hear you, Deon, if you're trying to ask a question.
Yes, I was trying to follow up. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Yes, indeed. Could you talk about your decision to attend college, and were there any teachers or any role models, family that were instrumental in your decision to attend college?
Well, I don't think when I was younger, I wanted to work for the electric company, which was like a cooperative electric company, a public electric company in Omaha. And that's kind of what I wanted to do. I always thought I'd, kind of drive one of those big trucks. And, that was interesting to me. And I never really had any real thoughts of going to college, but I did well academically. I did well in, probably from beginning in, first grade all the way through. Is I was always very successful with my schoolwork, and got the usual kinds of accolades and awards and things that you get when you're traveling through school. Had good test scores and things of that nature. And I never really thought much about college. It wasn't something that my parents, my mother was a nurse, so she had she had nursing school, basically a couple of years, which would probably amount to like an associate's degree. My father was a non-commissioned officer, NCO, in the military. He had a high school degree. My mother had a high school degree. And that was basically it. When I went off to college, I believe I was the first one in my family to go to college, at least of the level, the cousins and the aunts and uncles and all of that I was familiar with. I think I was the first one out. Certainly everybody else after me everybody went. But I think I may have been the first one to go to college. So it wasn't really something I was thinking about. I think what happened with me was, I had some good counselors and teachers at school who, it's not like anybody sat me down and said, well, you should go to college or you should do this. It was just that, we had good relationships that tell me about what they did and where they went to school and this, that, and the other. And I think, that was something that was on my radar, but it wasn't really what I really thought I was going to do until I took the PSAT test in my junior year, and I got a really high score, I don't know, 90 something percentile. I don't remember the score, but I do remember that I got a whole lot of letters and brochures and things from schools. And I started looking at them and I was like, wow, that looks kind of neat. Particularly the ones that started coming in from California and, warmer climates. I was like, oh yeah, that would be a nice place to go. So I think that was what attracted me in the first instance.
What school did you attend?
I went to Stanford University as an undergrad. And the thing about it is I went to Stanford mainly because of these brochures and things that they sent. And I said, oh, and Stanford has a beautiful campus, if not the most beautiful campus in the country, in my view. I just thought it was just gorgeous. Palm trees and, all of this green and, the kind of Spanish architecture. I was like, wow, this is great. And I was thinking, I knew a little bit about Stanford because, gosh, I can't remember his name right now, but there was a quarterback for Stanford that won the Heisman Trophy right about the time I was coming out of high school. And so I heard the school, I knew of it. Also knew they didn't have a very good football team because they got beat probably my senior year. They got beat by Michigan, something like 60 something to nothing. And so I was like, yeah, they're not that good, but I heard of them. Maybe I could walk on, they're not that good. I could probably walk on there. So I tried to walk on. I sent my materials in. They said, oh, just come on out, try out. So that was, I think that was what was attractive about Stanford, is that I thought I might be able to get on their football team because I played high school football. And I thought that, it was, kind of warm and, beautiful. And it was a long way from Nebraska, which I was ready to get out of. I did not know Stanford was an elite school. Nobody had told me that. And when I got there and I found it out, I was like, oh no, God, I made the wrong choice. I was not happy to be there, because, there was, private schools and the like in Omaha, and the kind of kids that went there were these nerdy little kids. And I didn't really see myself running with that crowd. I was like, oh no. So I was disappointed, and I was thinking about coming back, after my first, you get your first Christmas break. And then I was riding around with one of my buddies in his car around town. And he's like, yeah, we knew you were going to come back. We're like, nah, he'll be back. And that ticked me off, made me angry. So I said, I'll stick it out because I'll show them. And that's basically how, I wound up, graduating from Stanford in pretty good stead, I have to say.
I'm sure that in graduating, there were a fair share of challenges, as a young man at a TWI institution. Could you speak to any of those obstacles, challenges, aggressions, discriminations that you may have experienced, and how did you persevere and overcome?
Well, I think I persevered and overcome. Let me say this: Stanford is a PWI, yes. But Stanford has had at that point in time a very I wouldn't say long, but they had a very good history of recruiting African-American students there and supporting them while they're there. We had a African-American themed dorm called Ujamaa House. We had an African-American cultural center called the Black House. There was an African-American arts center where they put on plays and things. And then there were a lot of clubs and other associate things that, African-Americans had of their own. And this says nothing about the things that the Black students were doing when they were integrated. But there was a friend of mine who married a man who was the president of Morehouse probably 2 or 3 presidents ago. And I was having a conversation with her and I was asking her where her kids were going to go to school. And she said, well, our kids going to, both our son and our daughter going to Stanford. I said, really? I said, how'd they get away from Morehouse and Spelman? And she said, well, what Stanford's like, it provides a lot of support. You got like this, vibrant kind of Black community that's there. So, from her standpoint, it was her and her husband, who was the president of Morehouse, is that it was basically a kind of a HBCU that was inside of a PWI, because a lot of those experiences were things that students had there. And I would say the same, that I met so many people who were there that I could look up to, who were role models for me. Charles Ogletree is one who comes to mind. I just heard that another one of the people who I looked up to, who's actually a law student when I was an undergrad, but there weren't that many Black students there, so everybody knew everybody. Larry Irving was just appointed to be chair of the board of PBS stations, the PBS stations. So, there's a lot of people who were very accomplished, very capable, who were doing, good things. And during that period, which was the 70s, there was a lot of talk about, Black community and supporting one another. So we had organizations, we had clubs and groups of people who were out there trying to mentor people and kind of give them advice, and help them with their scholarship, with their work. So it was a very supportive environment for me in that sense. Now, having said that, what I remember that was to the contrary, I mean, sure, you're going to have these microaggressions and things that were going on. And what I remember was I graduated, at least I guess I was probably, I'm not sure, either my senior year or my junior year, whenever you apply for Fulbright Scholarship. So I had applied for these Fulbright Scholarship, Marshall Scholarship. There was some other one, I can't remember, but there's like all these scholarships are kind of administered by the same. And what I was interested in doing when I graduated was going to West Africa and studying the peanut trade in and Senegal, because I considered myself somewhat of a, economic, political economic person. I was interested in that type of thing. So I put a application in for that. And I went to one of these economics professors that I had a very, very difficult class. And, I had aced the class, got a, top grade. So I went to see him and see if he'd write a letter for me. And so he said to me, ask him to write the letter. He called me in his office. He said, I'm not writing a letter for you, Kenneth Nunn. You're not good enough of a student to get a reference from me. And I said, what? But I got an A in your class. He said, yeah, you got an A, but, lots of people get A's. Your A is not as good as, and he named somebody, so-and-so's A. Now, if he came to me and he asked me, who was not an African-American person, basically was a white male, if he came to me and asked me for a reference, then I would give him the reference. I'm not going to give it to you. So he hurt my feelings and I left, my lip stuck out, and I went to the African-American Studies Department and talked to one of the staff. She was kind of the grad student there. And I said, this guy said this to me, how can he say this, blah, blah, blah. She said, Kenneth, he did you a favor. Because what happens is a lot of people will not tell you that they have a favorite who they're trying to give this to, and they'll write you a letter and then they'll kill you with the way they write the letter. So you should just count your blessings and just move on, which I did. But I still thought it was effed up, to use an expression here, that he did it that way, that he couldn't see it was part of his job to kind of help me, move on with my life and my career in any way that he could, because he wasn't going to extend that to me. And my thought was it was because of the color of my skin.
How did you then move on? I guess from your interest in economics to law.
Well, I had an interest in economics. I had an interest in philosophy. I think what killed me and got me out of both of those, and I wound up with a degree in international relations and African-American studies. And what got me out of economics and philosophy is that you had to have higher order math. And I just was not cut out for it. I couldn't cut the grades, get the level of grades that I needed to be able to major in those two areas. And I didn't like it. So I said, okay, well, let me get into a major that I don't need math for. So I did that. Now, the other most significant part of my Stanford years is that I landed there in 1976, fall of 1976. And Soweto had happened in South Africa that year. And so the anti-apartheid movement in the United States began to take on a head of steam. And there were students at Stanford who formed a what we would call multicultural, coalition that was against apartheid in South Africa and against the university's involvement in any kind of support for the South African government, including the very substantial investments that Stanford had. So we had a protest. I wound up getting arrested in my freshman year, along with my roommate, who was a white farmer's kid from Nebraska as well. But we both went down to the sit-in. About 400 people got arrested. We took over the administration building. So I came out of that with, kind of an interest in social justice, of course, and in protests. And hopefully, the thought was, what can I do to kind of make the world a better place was sort of the whole thing. But all of that was kind of blowing up, and I was active in anti-apartheid efforts throughout the Bay Area when I was there, working with the Longshoremen's Union and, other groups of people, other student organizations at Berkeley and, San Jose State and other places. So, I was active and I was doing that kind of work. So I had to think about, well, what's the next step for me going to be? And, am I, like I said, I didn't get my Fulbright, so I was trying to decide what I was going to do. And so basically I took a year off. And during that year, I worked as a librarian for the Alameda County library. And my job was taking books into prisons and jails that were in Alameda County. So, I kind of had some exposure to that kind of experience, dealing with the legal system from that. And that was interesting. And then, being at Stanford, a lot of people go on to postgraduate work. And it's sort of like you're either going to be an engineer, you're going to be a lawyer, you're going to be a medical in the medical profession, or you're going to pursue a PhD. And so I was kind of torn between either the PhD or going to law school, and I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do. So I took that time out to think about it. And at the end of the year, I just said, yeah, I'm going to bite the bullet and go to law school. So I think that's how that came about.
Thank you.
What motivated you to become employed at UF?
Well, it was a woman, basically. So Deon knows my dear departed wife, who passed away last year, but she's the reason why I came to University of Florida. I came to University of Florida because after I left, I graduated from law school. My first job was as a public defender in San Francisco. And there was a woman who I had worked for as a law clerk before I graduated. And she called me up and said, hey, I know about this job in DC working for an anti-apartheid organization. And that just seems like the perfect thing for you. You should apply. And so I applied and I got the job. I moved to Washington, DC. And I didn't stay there very long because, it just didn't work out for me. And I decided to go back to being a public defender at the DC Public Defender. The DC Public Defender is considered an elite organization. Most of the people who are there are Harvard, Yale grads. There were a couple of grads from UC Berkeley, like I was, but as I said, most of them were Harvard, Yale people. So, but anyway, I got the job. I got that job, and I was working that job. And then I don't want to get into all the details, but I met Patricia. We got engaged. And she took she took a scholarship known as the McKnight scholarships, which many still ongoing. Many of the grad students here at the University of Florida who are African-American or Hispanic people of color, they may have expanded beyond that as far as I know, but it's a very well-supported fellowship. You get one of these McKnights, it's a full ride. They pay for everything, et cetera, et cetera. So at that point in time, when we were, dating and, hanging out in DC, Tricia happened to meet the person, Ike Tribble, who was head of the McKnight Fellowship, or the Florida Education Foundation, which, administered these fellowships. And he said, oh, you should do this. This would be great, blah, blah, blah. So she learned about it, thought it would be a great idea. Her family supported that. So she came down to Florida and started pursuing a PhD at Florida State. And so I was like, well, I guess I got to figure out how I'm going to move to Florida. So what happened was when I was working at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, which was ran the Southern Africa Project, which did the anti-apartheid work, there was a guy in the office next to me who had decided to go into law teaching. And so I kind of followed how he went through the process and, all of these sorts of things. And I said, oh, okay, I see what that is. And I wasn't thinking I would be a law teacher. It was the last thing on my mind. I was so happy to be out of law school, to be doing the actual work and, things that I thought were important and significant in the world. I had no interest or no idea that I was going to go back. So I said, okay, but I stuck a pin in it. And I said, maybe I'll come back to that some point in time. So what happened was when Tricia moved down to Florida, I said, well, I got to do something to get to Florida. And so, of course, I applied to all of the public defender organizations and defense firms and things that I knew about. And I also thought about going into law teaching. So as it turns out, there's a annual conference for law teachers or for people who are interested in going to law teacher. And that conference is held in Washington, D.C. at a hotel that was steps away from where my apartment was. So I signed up, filled out all the forms, went to the conference, and I had like a number of places that were interested in me, and that brought me back for like a callback or a flyback interview. One of which was Florida State. So I went through all of that, and I would say that, you start dealing with that in November, and you usually know by the end of the year where you stand, with people. So basically, I get to the end of the year, and I had some places that looked interesting. I'd come back down to Tallahassee for my interview at Florida State. But they had me on hold. They didn't seem to be moving with my application. And then, I had some offers from some other schools up north, and I was like, okay, well, that's probably where I'm going to go. I'd like to get to Florida, but it looks like that's not going to happen. Tricia, maybe you might want to transfer and go to another school. We're having that conversation. So I had heard from University of Florida. At the time, I was very busy. I had a very demanding job. I probably was putting in 70 hours a week in the work that I was doing, which is not unusual for a relatively new lawyer. But I was putting in a lot of work, and I just really, was trying to stay afloat. So there came a point in time where I just said, I'm going to shut down this process of looking for a job. I'm going to go with, either these ones that make me an offer, or maybe I won't be a law teacher, whatever, but I'm done with all of that, because that is time consuming to have to fly off to another location. And, you go through all of the types of interviews that you go through when you're looking for a faculty position, and talk to all the stakeholders and all of that. That was just getting to be too much. So I said, no, I'm not going to do it. So late in March, I got a call from Barry Currier, who was then the associate dean of the law school here. And he said, Ken Nunn, we saw you in DC. We're really interested in you. We'd like to have you come down. And I said, well, no, Barry, I appreciate that, but, I'm done. I'm not interested. But, thanks for calling. And basically, I hung up on him. I didn't hang up, but, we ended the conversation. I was like, no, that's a no. I'm not going to go to University of Florida. So he probably a couple of days later, he called me back. And he said, Ken, I know you're not really interested and blah, 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 but what can I do to make you, just come for an interview, just kind of see how it all works out. What can I do to change your mind? And I said, well, it's really nice of you to call me back. I'll tell you what, if my wife, or not my wife, my fiance is in Tallahassee. You know, I tell you what, if you can arrange for me to have a layover in Tallahassee for my flight down, which would kind of fit with her spring break, I was like, well, then, you know, I'll do it. I'll come down if we can do that. He says, oh, that's not a problem. We can definitely do that. So I came down, I, you know, had my interview here, and then I went to Tallahassee and, you know, spent the week with Patricia. So when I had my interview here, there was a part of it where I went in a room and, you know, they always have students interview faculty. And this interview took place in the dean's conference room, and it was filled with students. I would say a multicultural group of students. And when I got there, they started asking me these questions about who was I and what was my background, and did I know anything about Black people, being from Omaha, Nebraska, and all that. And essentially they're trying to figure out how Black was I? Was I really a Black person, or was I one of these fake Black people that I guess had been interviewing at the University of Florida they were quite familiar with? I was like, you know, I was somewhat amused by the questions, but I think I answered them to their satisfaction. And ultimately I got an offer from the University of Florida. But I mentioned that to just say, I've learned from that process that the reason why the university reached out to me as late as they did was because the students had a protest here at the University of Florida. They had a sit-in the dean's office over the lack of diversity on their faculty. So what had happened is at that time, they had one African-American on the faculty, a guy by the name of Michael Moorhead, who, you know, was the first tenured African-American on the faculty here. And that was it. And they wanted the faculty to hire other African-Americans. So they had their protests. And so it became kind of an issue. I think the administration went back, started flipping through the book. What, did we see this Black guy in Washington, D.C.? Who's he? You know, so they went back, found me, and brought me down. And as they say, the rest was history.
What year was that you started?
I started in 1990. So all of that would have been, that would have been the spring of 1990. And I started in the summer.
Can you talk about, I mean, you mentioned some of, you know, the students and students' actions, but in coming here in 1990, could you speak to the law school's history, or, you know, and the rich history that it has in, you know, for making campus what it is today? What was your awareness of it? And you know, how did you see yourself fitting into that history at that moment?
Well, I didn't know anything about the history of the University of Florida. And one of the things that I tell my colleagues, I think this is true to this day, is that people who are north of I-10 have a hard time telling the difference between Florida State and the University of Florida. And we like to pat ourselves on the back and say, oh, we're the flagship university and we're this and that and all of that. But I think that for me, I was like, it's some school down in the South there that had not much of a reputation as far as I was concerned. But, you know, you know, once I got here, of course, then I learned about the history of the school, and particularly its racial history. And, you know, that I learned, for example, I mean, you know, it's kind of interesting to me to go to be hired at a school. And, you know, I never really saw myself as an African-American first, okay, or even second or close to anything like that, because almost every environment that I'd been in, you know, from high school through college, there were, you know, generations of African-Americans before me. Okay. It wasn't like, you know, I was the first African-American at Stanford or Berkeley or, you know, at the San Francisco Public Defender's Office or at the DC Public Defender's Office. You know, I mean, it wasn't something I even thought of. You know, this is the 1970s. I'm thinking integration. Well, 1970s when I came through high school. This is 1990s, right? So I'm thinking integration was something that happened in the 50s and the 60s. But then when you look at the University of Florida history, I don't think the first person from the University of Florida even graduated until 1967. I think that was when Judge Mickle and his group graduated. So we're talking about the 1970s, just a trickle in the 1960s, and then 1970s is a trickle, and you had this big Black Thursday walkout that happened in the 1970s. I think it was probably around 78, 77, something like that. So, it was somewhat strange, but I understood. Yeah, there was a lot of a lot of segregated history here. The whole thing with Virgil Hawkins being the person who actually desegregated the university, wanting to get into the law school and being deprived of entering the law school. I mean, that's all stuff that I became aware of that was meaningful to me. And I was grateful for the fact that I was able to walk in the path that these people, people like Virgil Hawkins and like George Allen here at the law school, our first graduate, that they pay for us. They prepared for us. I thought that was, an honor to be here under those circumstances.
And could you in your time, on record, we noticed that by 1999 you were appointed associate dean for the Law Center Affairs. Could you speak about that appointment and your subsequent resignation?
Well, what was going on at the law school was there were a lot of racial issues that had to do with the hiring of African-American faculty and other faculty of color, that had to do with the admissions of African-American students and kind of the shifting admissions processes that we were dealing with in that era. Like at one point we had a dean for minority affairs, and we had, scholarships and things that were targeted at African Americans and stuff. And then you kind of have one Florida come along and all these things start to change. So there were things we were fighting for. It was a struggle. So John Mills got appointed originally as the interim dean. And he became the dean because the dean before him, Richard Matazar, got canned, okay? And he got canned because he named the law school after Levin. And because he named it after Levin, and Levin was Jewish, is how I interpret it. There are other explanations, but they don't really make much sense to me. But I think what it was, people said, "Oh, well, he was a personal injury lawyer," so they didn't like that. But Levin had made all this money in the tobacco litigation, so he had a lot of money, and he gave the largest donation up until that time that the University of Florida had seen. I think it was like $25 million or something. So he made this big donation that Matazar thought like, "Oh, I have a feather in my cap because I got this great donation." But basically what it was is people like, that's not the kind of person we want the law school named after. Some people said it's because of the practice that he had. My assessment based on, the reactions and my view of the people that I heard talking about it was that it was a good old boy thing, and he was Jewish, and they didn't want the law school named after him. So eventually the dean got canned. And so John Mills stepped in as an interim dean. And he came to me and he said, "Ken, do you want to be associate dean?" I was like, "Nope." I said, there's a lot, there's a lot here. People are going to be upset about that. And, John had connections with the Black community and stuff. And so he was like, no, but I think it'd be, kind of a useful thing to do, be important. You should do this. And I said, well, John, I'll think about it, but this is what I want is I want control over appointments. I want control over admissions. The issues that we were fighting for, I was like, I want that. And that's why I had this title of Law Center Affairs was basically what the Associate Dean Law Center Affairs. I said, I wasn't interested in, replacing the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs that has to deal with developing, entry-level faculty, their research and their writing and stuff like that. Although that was part of what I was doing, I wanted to have some other things that were part of my, my bailiwick. And so he said, okay, well, that's fine. We'll do that. So he brought me in, and then there was almost immediate, the faculty just kind of erupted. There's this immediate pushback. How can he give Ken Nunn that, authority over this or that? And then, start pushing back and, trying to winnow away and get, pieces of my, my wheelhouse kind of carved off. So there's a fair amount of resistance to it. I think John, did a courageous act, did what he could, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't, it wasn't a struggle. So it was a struggle. And then what happened, my resignation took place because I was at a faculty meeting, and every year when we have a faculty meeting, we would vote on the policy for appointments. And the appointments policy is what the appointments committee had to follow in terms of looking for additional faculty. And so the appointments, usually what it is it's stuff like, we will look for 3 people. One of them will teach torts. One of them will specialize in corporations, and one of them will specialize in, whatever, criminal law, whatever. So, that's the policy. And then the committee would go out to try and find people to fulfill that. Well, this year they added on language that they will try to, to be honest, I'm not sure if the language was diversity or affirmative action. I think it was probably affirmative action was what they were talking about 2000. It may have been either our diversity needs or our affirmative action needs. And so that was controversial. There's a lot of pushback on the faculty about it. And we were at a faculty meeting, and there was a big blow up over the inclusion of that language. And one of the faculty persons said something along the lines of, we can't hire, these unqualified people to come in here and teach our students. That's the problem. I think that language has to go because it leads to that. And I found it offensive when I was sitting there. And I kind of looked around. I was waiting for someone, one of my white colleagues to say, well, this is offensive. We're not going to do that. But there was like crickets. Nobody said anything. So what you have to understand, I came up in the 1960s, 1970s, and there were all kinds of kind of social justice protests and issues that are going on. And quite often what you would see is you'd see the institution, whether it was a academic intellectual institution like a college or university, or it was, the city or the state or some government agency or whatever, they had a Black person who was part of their organization already. And they'd send that Black person out to kind of talk to the Black protesters and calm them down and, kind of be the face of everything's going to be all right and kumbaya and all that. And so in my mind, I was like, I am not going to be that person. That is not me. So I went home after that and I talked to Patricia, and Patricia's parents happened to be at her house that day. And I came home, I said, Tricia, I'm going to quit. She said, well, hold up now, wait a minute. I said, no, I'm not going to quit my job or the paycheck. I'm going to quit this position. I don't want to be associate dean. And so we talked it over and she agreed with me that what I told her is, and I said, I don't want to be that person. And if there's going to be a faculty meeting and they're going to attack the administration or attack the policy, and there's a racial aspect to that, I want to be free to be the person who's going to champion those needs, instead of, the person who's going to come out like I felt like I can't say anything negative about the school. I have to be able to speak truth. So I said, no, and this is the piece of this that's missing is at that point in time, I was the only African-American on the faculty. So it wasn't like anybody else could step forward and do that and we could play the inside-outside game. It was me. So the question was, am I going to be inside and have my voice silenced or at least diminished to some extent? Or am I going to be outside and be the person who can advocate for some of these things that I could clearly see were necessary to advocate for at the University of Florida at that time. So I decided to step down. And from my position, I was like, well, I'll just call John up. John, I want to step down. This is why. He's like, okay, fine. Well, just think about it and don't, just let me know what your decision is. Don't make any rash decision. I said, okay, fine. I'll sleep on it. So I slept on it and I decided that, no, I'm not going to be the associate dean anymore. And I went about my teaching and, my writing and, other committee activity and work that I had to do. And I didn't pay that much attention to it. But what happened is the very same person who had made those comments in the faculty meeting that led to my decision to resign decided to run his mouth off to his students. Yeah, well, we had a Black associate dean, but, he resigned because, we weren't going to let him do, he just went on. And apparently one of the students in the class was dating a person who was a reporter for one of the Florida papers, the Florida, it was either the St. Pete Times at the time or the Tampa Tribune. I'm not sure which one, but one of these papers had a guy who was, he was dating a UF law student. So he called me up probably about a week or so later. And he said, do you have any comment, Professor Nunn, about, why you resigned and this, that, and or the other? And I said, well, I really don't have a comment. I don't want to say anything. It's not that big of a deal. And then he read to me, he had found the faculty person who had made the comments in class. I guess he talked to him first. And he read to me his comments, which were offensive. And I said, and he got me all riled up and angry. And so then I decided to make a statement. I made a statement. And the next thing you knew, this thing blew up. It was sort of like, what's going on here at UF now about academic freedom. I mean, it was all over the papers and the news and this, that, and the other. And, became an issue. And I think because it became an issue, I think that there were some changes at the University of Florida. We went from one African-American at the law school to, I believe, 5, which is what we actually had before we went through this process where everybody quit and said they were leaving because it was racially, problematic here. So I think that helped us at the law school, and I think it helped other other institutions on campus to kind of focus on the need for diversity and to get involved with their faculty hiring. and try and diversify the faculty. And I think there's some number of people who came to University of Florida after that, and I always felt happy and proud that I was able to contribute a little something to that outcome.
You know, Professor Nunn, last follow-up question on that. You know, now, I guess then, like now, you know, we often have commissions. And I noted that Dean Mills at the time appointed a commission to investigate racism and what was going on at the College of Law. Were there benefits to that investigation or that commission study, or what outcome came out of it?
Well, nothing really solid as far as I was concerned. I think that we know about commissions and you know, blue ribbon, you know, panels and this, that, and the other is quite often a place where you send things to die that you don't want to do anything about. You know, there was that. He had a couple outside consultants come in to talk about the racial climate at the law school and what could be done about it. I don't think anything really solid came out of any of those efforts. You know, you're dealing with an entrenched faculty of people who are tenured, who have an inordinate amount of power. There's not much you can do to get rid of them. They have a certain amount of political support for what they're doing at some levels of the university. The alumni base, to a great degree, at that point in time, probably supported what they were trying to do too. So it's hard. You know, I think it was hard to make lasting change, but I certainly don't think that the committees contributed too much. I will dare say, though, that there were people on the law school faculty and throughout the university who heard the critique and stepped forward to see what they could do as allies to help bring about change at the university. I think there was, as I said, some change, but you know, it's always a continuing struggle when you're talking about these kinds of issues. I don't think you ever reach a point where you can sit on your laurels and say, well, you know, that matter has been completed. And we can certainly see that today in terms of some of the political forces and where they're going, in terms of not teaching about the accurate history of the state of Florida and the region in which we live. So anyway, the struggle continues. You keep fighting, hopefully making progress and laying the groundwork for people to come along behind you and keep the struggle alive.
Thank you.
Dr. Nunn, just to sort of like switch gears a little bit, but on a related point, actually, having been through the academic system as you have, do you think that the tenure and promotion process is fair?
Well, I don't think that the hiring process is fair. So why would I think that the tenure and promotion process is fair? I mean, part of the problem when we're talking about hiring is the law itself is skewed and is wrong, because what the law says is that I can't hire a person because they are African American. In other words, the law makes the assumption that there's nothing about a person's African American background, heritage, or culture that is beneficial to the University of Florida or any university anywhere, or any institution in the United States. They basically play this game where they try to tell you that you don't exist and that your culture doesn't exist, your family doesn't exist, and that you contribute nothing. It's almost as if you're saying, yeah, well, everything that's happened in music is just happenstance, has nothing to do with those African drums that were brought over here from, the other side of the Atlantic. And we can't talk about that. Let's just talk about music generically. And then when you wind up talking about music generically, then what you're talking about is you're talking about Mozart and, Bach and, people like that. And you're not talking about musicians of color and the rich contribution that cultures of color have made to what we now call American music. And the same thing is true when we talk about academia and you talk about law. What you want is, you said we want people who are qualified, but qualified to do what? Qualified to basically do the same thing that the majority people who are already here are doing, not adding anything different in terms of what their focus is or what their object of study is or what their contribution in terms of this is where I'm going to apply my talents to this particular problem or this particular social issue. So I think part of the problem is that, we don't look at that as being part and parcel of what you need to do as a faculty member. And that's true whether we're talking about hiring or whether we're talking about promotion and tenure. And then you have the problem that I had when I was an undergraduate where, somebody's going to say, in essence, the white man's ice is colder. They're going to say, oh, well, that person may have these qualifications, but they're not the best. They're not that's not our view of what excellence is. And well, can you articulate to me what that view of excellence is? Well, no, but this, I know it when I see it. And so you have to deal with that, and both in terms of getting people into the pipeline and then getting them through the pipeline. It's the same problem.
Now, you when you step down from your position as associate dean, what made you decide not to leave the university entirely? I mean, going through what you went through, seeing that whole episode play out before you, what sort of modulated your final decision to stay and not leave entirely?
Well, I had other offers. There were places people called me up. I knew people, I guess, around the country and other places, and folks that I'd met through the law, faculty ranks, and people who were attracted to these, the flood of publicity that surrounded all of that. So there are people who reached out to me and said, hey, are you interested in coming to this place or that place? At the end of the day, I think it was a decision that we made as a family that being in Gainesville, was better for our own personal needs and what was, the needs of our children at that time, that it wasn't a good time to be moving. And so we stayed. I'm not at all disappointed for staying. I think that in particular, Patricia has had, kind of a very deep influence on this community. And, it was very valuable to the community for her to be here. And I think it was valuable to her in terms of getting some things that she needed to get done. And I think we're a good team. I think we worked well together, and as I said, at the end of the day, this was the best choice, was to remain in Gainesville. So that's what we did.
Okay. The next couple of questions I have actually are regarding administration. In your view, what can the administration do to recruit Black faculty and staff members?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the most important thing is you have to make people feel like they're wanted. I think that, for example, to tell people that we do not want you to teach critical race theory, and that means a couple of things, because you could talk about that as being a attack on critical race theory as a particular discipline. And so people do that. I mean, that is a recognized form of legal scholarship and teaching. So if you tell people you can't do critical, and it's beyond law now, it started in law, but it's beyond law. It's in a lot of different areas. But if you say that we don't want people to teach that, or you can't teach that, then there are some people, and to a great degree in the academy today, if you're talking about people of color, probably some of your best scholarly recruits are going to be in that area. They're going to say that's like a not welcome sign. So they're going to say, no, I'm not going to come. But the other part of it is, I think that the attack on critical race theory is not really an attack on critical race theory as a discipline, because nobody knows what critical race theory is anyway. What it is it's a broader attack on, sort of the whole notion of there being Black experience or Black culture, or, anything that's beyond what the white majority, well, it's really not the white majority. It's a certain minority of whites view as being important and significant. And it's political, it's highly political. And people see that, they read that, they know what's going on. So I think that the first thing that an administration can do is to do things like say, we stand for academic freedom. This is what is important. And we know that different faculty are going to do different things, and you want to recruit people on that basis. I think it's important to try and build a critical mass of people. As it turns out, every African-American person, I actually have a lot of respect and admiration for Deon. Deon and I have connected outside of the university in other forums. I can't necessarily say that's true with every African-American on this campus. That's not always the case. So there's a great degree of diversity that you have, even when you're talking about the people who's supposed to bring diversity, that there's a great degree of breadth of experience and interest and all of that in any of those groups. So you got to have enough folks who are there so that anybody who comes can feel that, well, there's support for me. And just because there's another Black face, there's one other Black face or whatever there, that doesn't necessarily mean you have that. So you have to have what I call a critical mass, so that you now have an organic community and not one that is, just tossed together. That's vibrant and living. And people can look at that and they can say, okay, well, there are some people here and some social things that are happening and some political things that are happening that I feel like I can fit into. And that's attractive to people to come as well, particularly in a town that's small as Gainesville, because if the University of Florida was in Orlando or in Tampa or Miami or some other larger city, even Jacksonville, the city itself would provide, probably that type of thing. And then your job at the university is just your job. But all of that figures largely in a city the size of Gainesville, where you're not going to get that from other places. So, that's, I think it's important for, you to have, a critical mass to account for that here.
Now, how can Black faculty and staff increasingly stand together in solidarity to address these systemic issues in your view?
Well, I think that's the point, is that you have to stand in solidarity to address the issues. You can't just go back into this is my little piece of the university. This is where my research is, or these are the issues that I'm interested in. I mean, there has to be some understanding that it's a collective struggle, and that I can tell you, in my discipline, there is not a single African American. And that's a broad phrase, because when I say African American, it means probably anybody of African descent, because you could be from Jamaica or Nigeria or whatever. But if you're in law teaching and you have a job in a predominantly white law school, which is most of them, you did not get that job on your own. It is virtually impossible for you to get a job as a law teacher without somebody on the inside doing something, working behind the scenes to get you in. Now, that person on the inside is not always another person of color, but quite often it is. So, you can say, oh, I have this hotshot resume and I did this or that. And, I could probably point to some things in my resume that made me feel like I was a hotshot. But at the end of the day, if it wasn't for those students who were fighting to get greater diversity here, and if it wasn't for the people who are already on the faculty who had decided that, well, we need to hire a Black person, and we need to reach out to one, we need to talk to them about their concerns, we need to support them in the application process and working through. If it wasn't for that, then I wouldn't have been here. And I dare say that's true for every person. And all of them aren't that. I don't think all of them are necessarily people who would agree with me and agree with my politics. But I do think that's true, that without having that extra, sort of conscious decision to reach out to people and make a deliberate effort to diversify these faculties, it wouldn't have happened.
That is so true. I mean, that is true even in my case too, Professor Nunn, too, as well, that I wouldn't be here if it was not someone at the door welcoming me in to say, hey, and I'm still here. With that said, you talked a lot about allyship, back when you talked about when you first came to UF. And, that is a term that we hear a lot more. And as you have, touched on some, could you expound on, what does it really mean to be an ally for the cause?
Well, I think what being the different, the specific term ally, I think, is different from being a term like a comrade or a co-fighter or whatever. So and that's important too. It's important for us to have maybe a collective struggle, right? And understand that we all have to contribute to this struggle in our own ways. I think that's important. But what I think is unique about being an ally is that you're prepared to take a step back. So I can have a co-struggle with women or with LGBTQ, however many alphabets we got there, on issues that are relevant to them. That are relevant to us all. I can be kind of a person who's working together with all of them. But at the same time, there are going to be some issues that fall into the area of, say, women or feminists or whatever, that for me to advocate for, all I'm doing is contributing to the unjust system that already is pre-existing. Okay, so the best thing for me to do is to say, I'm going to support you. I'm going to let you take the lead and you tell me what you need. I'm not going to be the spokesperson. I'm not going to be the person who's pushing for whatever the transformation we're talking about having. But I'm here to help you, right? And so I think that there are times when you need to be an ally, and then there are times when you need to be kind of a co-activist with people. But that's what I see allyship is about. Allyship is about letting these other, what I would call communities, take the lead and say what it is that they need and what they want, and be willing to support.
Having sort of been there when a lot of Black faculty left the university, what would you recommend that the administration do to retain Black faculty and staff members?
Mm-hmm. Well, you got to treat people fairly, first of all. When I was here in the late 90s, because basically I came in 90 and as I said, I was one of two. And so we had two, and then we added three. So we had five. But from 98 through 2000, three of those five left. And right at 98, we the original faculty member here at the law school, he retired. So, and then we had three leave, and the three who left said they were real clear why they were leaving. They were leaving because of microaggressions and other racist acts that were taken against them, in terms of things like pay, in terms of things like, the amount of work that you had to do in order to get recognition, microaggressions that people might, say things to you or try and intimidate you around particular issues and things like that. So these are the things. So what you want to do to retain faculty, treat them fairly. Treat them like everybody else. Don't have a situation where your faculty of color make less money than everybody else. Don't have a situation where people who get, there are all kinds of perks and, kind of a hierarchy of privilege and stuff that exists in academia, this position or this chair, or, to be able to do one thing or another. Those have to be fairly allotted. Who's going to be chair? Well, is it fair that everybody gets their opportunity to be chair? So that's part of the problem, is that there's not fairness that's taking place, and people feel that. And so they're like, okay, well, I don't need to be here. The other thing is, I think it's important to make sure that there's a welcoming community for people. Okay. And that folks need to feel, whether it's students or faculty, because I think it's the same thing. They need to feel that when I get to this place, there's going to be support for me. I think it's helpful to know that, there are other, if we just to work with African Americans, talk about African Americans, there's other African American faculty there, or there are African American administrators who are there. There's some African American cultural outlets that are in the town and that are accessible, and things that I can do and stuff like that. So I think that all those things, building that kind of climate is very useful and helpful. And certainly when you're in a university or in a town where the biggest and largest employer is the University of Florida, then those are things that they can do. And actually, I'll have to say this, that at least within the last, I would say, decade or so that I've been in Gainesville, I would say the University of Florida has done a pretty good job. Not perfect, not excellent, but there used to be a time when if I went into any restaurant or grocery store in the town, and I saw a professional-looking African-American person who was there, I would know who they are. And so nowadays, that's not necessarily true. There are people I see, and I'm like, I don't know who that person is. I don't know who he is or who she is. So there are enough people who are in town. Sometimes they're not university employees. They may be employed by the county or the city or whatever. But I'm just saying that number has definitely increased to the point that I don't have, kind of an easy recollection of who everybody is in town. And, I think that's just because the number has increased.
Professor Nunn, it can be said a lot of times, that integration has been like that double-edged sword, and that, even though the numbers have increased, it seems like we have lost that community, that sense of cohesiveness in the community, where we kind of knew everyone. And, it seems like your answer kind of speaks to that. But as we wrap up final questions, one of the ones I wanted to touch on was what are your thoughts on converting lectureship positions into tenure track positions, and how should how best should we approach this process? Because we seem to have a number of Black faculty as lecturers, and not in tenure track positions. So what are your thoughts and views on that?
Well, that's a complicated issue, Deon. I'm happy to tell you what my thoughts are, and I'm glad you brought it up, but it is complicated. And one of the reasons why it's complicated is because it goes to the heart or the core of what faculty should be and what they should be doing. Now, one of the things we can see from some of the current events that are going on is that if you are not a tenure track faculty, it makes you vulnerable. Actually, not to say tenure track, you're not tenured. So having tenured faculty is a very important thing. But the problem with having tenured faculty is then you get into this whole issue about, well, what is it that your tenured faculty should be doing? And it's quite clear in a research university such as the University of Florida, they're not interested in having tenured faculty who teach or who primarily teach. And then what you start talking about is, well, how are we making sure that the educational needs of our students are being met when, research is being developed and, kind of promulgated through the rest of the country and the world? How do we make sure that the needs of our student population get met? The thing about being a lecturer is that probably when you start looking at not just who's teaching the students, but who's there to be their advisors and to help their organizations and, to kind of be present for them in their lives, you are going to probably see more people who are lecturers who are able to do that and who do that than when you're talking about tenured faculty. Now, there are certainly tenured faculty that do those sort of things. I know in my career, I've been an advisor for many different student groups, and of all walks and backgrounds. But the fact of the matter is that here's a kind of a problem. Is that, let's say you go out there and you're interested in looking for a person who's going to be your tenured faculty. Then the question is what should that person's background be? And quite often what it turns out to be is that what faculty are looking for is they're looking for someone who's like them. And, and so this is just a human thing, right? I don't think there's a whole lot of kind of, mystery about it. It's just that it's a human issue, not necessarily malintent, but a human issue is you're looking for people like you. You want, a predominantly white faculty who's trying to hire for diversity purposes. They want to hire someone who they can go out and have a beer with, or they feel comfortable inviting to their house, and et cetera, et cetera. So they're going to be looking for faculty who are socially like them, who are intellectually like them, who are doing similar research to the research that they're doing, et cetera, et cetera. So then where do you have the students who can come in and say, well, but this is the kind of person that we're interested in terms of having a faculty person here. They need to be kind of faculty person who's going to be open to students and student engagement and who care about issues that are relevant to the comfort of communities of color here. The local community, do they have any input in that and what these faculty should look like? No. So basically what I'm telling you is you have groups that probably have the least commitment to the survival and ongoing, sort of success of African-American community, going to be the ones making the choice over who gets come in. You're going to see more of that when you're talking about tenured faculty than when you talk about untenured faculty. So, you get this divide as a consequence of that. And that's a big problem that I see. I'm not quite sure how that problem can be fixed. As you say, there are some problems that are inherent when we start talking about, desegregation or, providing diversity for PWIs as opposed to having historically Black colleges that focus on a particular, community and its interests. So, so I don't know how you fix that, but I do realize that it's complicated. And I think one needs to, first of all, be attentive to the fact that that problem is there.
The last question we have for you, Dr. Nunn, is what do you think about the Black Lives Matter movement?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that I was happy to see it. Let me just start with that. But I will say that I think it's ill-named because my point of view is that from where I sit, and I've been involved with the criminal legal system for, I don't know, 35 years, maybe close to 40 years. And I've been a Black man in America for longer than that. And from my observation, I think it's very clear to me that Black lives do not matter. What I think is what the organizers around that point wanted to make, the point they wanted to make was that Black lives should matter. And I certainly agree with that. Black lives should matter. I think it's clear, as I said, that presently they do not. As a matter of fact, they matter so little that just even asserting the fact that they should matter is controversial. And I think that's a shame, but that's where we are. Now, the other thing that I did like, and to some degree, it was because of the groundwork that was laid by the Black Lives Matter movement. And I mean movement. I'm not talking about, some ivory tower intellectual who decided that we're going to incorporate this and we're going to put out what we think the proposals are that Black Lives Matter ought to follow, or whatever. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about there was an organic indigenous movement that went across this country where people were saying Black Lives Matter. And they were protesting for the improvement of Black lives. And I think that was a positive thing. And because of the groundwork that they laid out there, we started to see last summer after George Floyd was, murdered, basically. We saw a lot of political activism around race and around, sort of social justice and racial equity. So I think that, so that's good. But what was the backlash to that? The backlash to that is what gave us January 6th. And it's what gave us the let's get rid of critical race theory. Let's pass laws so that aggressively conservative whites can drive into protests and hurt and kill people and not get charged. Okay, so we have laws like that popped up around the country, including here in Florida. All of that is the backlash, because at the end of the day, there is a substantial number of Americans who cannot tolerate the thought that Black lives should matter. So, to some degree, it was rattling the cage of the bear. Whether we're going to see enough good-hearted people, whether they're people of color or allies, or just, sort of a mass of socially justice-minded people, kind of react to the backlash and still push us forward, remains to be seen. But, I'm kind of, I guess at this point, going to be a interested observer of where we go from here, and maybe a participant in what happens afterwards, but we'll just have to see.
Well, Professor Nunn, thank you so much for the time that you gave us this afternoon. We don't want to keep you any longer here. We really appreciate it. It was an amazing walk through your childhood, your formative years through your professional career. We really appreciate it. It was a true learning experience. What I'm going to do now is turn the recorder off. I do have a couple of follow-up questions before we conclude entirely, but I'd like to end the recording at this point. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Glad you invited me to come.